Thanks for being here. Thanks for being here online. The screen says 200 days of war, can Ukraine still count on global support? It's actually exactly 30 weeks since the Russian-Ukraine invasion of Ukraine on February the 24th, which by my count is 210 days. Just for those of you who may be joining for the first time, I'm Giles Whittell, an editor at Tortoise, I should say. We have spent most of the past 2 weeks, I was going to say celebrating, marking one particular death, but in the course of the past 7 months, by my colleague Nina's, and I will introduce Nina properly in a second, estimate, dozens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians have died. By a very conservative estimate, 9,000 Ukrainian soldiers have died. The official Russian estimate of their own military deaths as of yesterday is 5.9 thousand. We reckon that's an underestimate by an order of magnitude. More realistic estimates of Russian military deaths range from 20 to 50,000. It is, of course, a humanitarian disaster, more than 6 million displaced. Global gas price spike largely attributable to the war, inflation being driven by that spike all around the world, recession risk, and of course, as of yesterday morning, Putin's so-called partial mobilization order, which looks more like a mass mobilization order, Defense Minister saying 300,000 extra Russian troops will be mobilized. It seems that the real figure that they have in mind is 1 million. You can see online fighting-age Russian men, in some cases arguing against the mobilization, for example in Dagestan, and in others willingly going in to join up. And last but by no means least, an explicit threat from Putin yesterday morning of nuclear escalation with the rider, "I'm not bluffing." On the plus side, on the battlefield, Ukraine is winning, or that's our impression anyway. And one of many questions that I hope that we can address over the next hour is that true? How much does the impression of Ukraine prevailing matter to the question on the screen, Ukraine's allies' unity? How important is that for Ukraine's eventual victory? And what are the best forecasts that we can come up with for what will happen over the next 6 cold months? So we are joined, I hope, online by Maria Zolkina, a political analyst at the Ilko Kucherev Democratic Initiatives Foundation. Maria, thank you very much for joining us. Here by Nina Kuriata, who I'm going to call tonight our Ukraine editor. And Nina was previously, as those of you who work for Tortoise know, head of the BBC's Ukrainian service in Kyiv. We're very privileged to have you. And by Professor Lawrence Friedman, Emeritus Professor of War Studies, at King's College London. Let me start, Maria, with you, if I can. For a sit-rep, in a sense, 6 weeks ago, us sort of armchair analysts saw what looked like a stalemate along the front lines. And now it feels like anything but. There's been this dramatic breakthrough east of Kharkiv. What happened? How do you explain that?
Hello, good evening. Unfortunately, the connection seems to be asking me about Kharkiv counteroffensive, so I missed actually the half of the question. Can you repeat, please, because connection is not well right now.
Of course. I'm just asking you for your explanation of the breakthrough.
First of all, Ukraine has to prove that all the support, all the military, first of all, support which were sent to Ukraine is used in the most effective way which was possible at that point of time. So that was one reason. Second reason was, of course, the capacity of the army itself to do that, because whenever Ukraine will be able to restore the control over its entire territory, we need to start as soon as possible if we have enough capacities, and capacities for at least this breakthrough, very rapid and very efficient in Kharkiv region. It took place and it played its role. The third reason, let's say, is public expectations. So Ukrainian society is extremely united around the idea that the Ukrainian army is fully capable of winning and prevailing over Russian one. So as of now, for instance, this is the main reason, according to the latest public opinion polls face-to-face, conducted in Ukraine in the middle of August, more than 70% say that the main idea which unites Ukrainian society is belief in absolutely realistic victory over Russia. And of course, some sophisticated planning, I would say. This war is the war of skills, bravery, and sophisticated planning from Ukrainian side, because Russia was waiting for counteroffensive, and most probably, as the rest of the world was waiting for a Ukrainian counteroffensive in another part of the front line, namely in the south, but the main attack was in absolutely different place, and in my opinion, that was one of the trigger for this decision, for this recent decision of Russia to conduct so-called referendums in a rapid way, because Luhansk province, from where I'm originally, for instance, became, as from Russian point of view, actually, became found itself under the real risk of being next in turn for the occupation, and that's why this breakthrough of Ukrainian army there played extremely significant role for overall situation on the front line and for political component of this conflict as well.
Thank you. About a day after the Ukrainian forces reached, reached Izium, the New York Times published a detailed report on US intelligence assistance. Now, without detracting in any way from the bravery and resourcefulness of the Ukrainian forces or the spirit of the people, was that, in your opinion, and is it generally felt that Western allies' assistance has been important? I mean, quite apart from, obviously, hardware, military hardware, quite a lot of that has been sent, but is there a sense in Ukraine that intelligence assistance has been important as well?
There is very clear understanding, I would say, both in expert community and among wide public, that Western support, quality and quantity of the weapons, exchange in a real time of intelligence data, is of crucial importance for what is being done practically on the ground by Ukrainian soldiers. And this has been proven to be very effective cooperation. To some extent, of course, someone might claim that from Ukrainian point of view, it might be not very fair because only Ukrainians are fighting, but actually this is, let's say, a deal, and it is perceived as a deal. So we are fighting, we are defending our territory and not only our own security interest. And that's why we value that support which is being sent to us. That's why this part of this component of these successes or prospective successes, which we count on, is absolutely highlighted in local medias. Is absolutely positively seen by local public. And that's why we understand that without that kind of support, regardless of quantity of soldiers ready to fight, we won't be able to do that at this very moment if we didn't have enough support of the needed quality from our Western allies.
Maria, thank you. We'll come back to you, and I hope the link stays up. Nina, let me ask you now. First of all, I love the Ukrainian yellow top. You've had the opportunity to witness us, and you've helped us understand a bit what's going on, but also you have contacts, obviously, in Kyiv and family in Odessa, and a much better sense than we do of what is actually happening in Ukraine. How well do you think people like us and following online understand what's going on in this war on the front line and in Ukraine more generally?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very important question, because I have to admit that even we Ukrainians, before the war started, we couldn't even imagine how might it be, like how terrible might it be, because people had some thoughts that even if Russians come, maybe they will just change the flag and you will just live your life as you lived, but under a different flag, under different legislation, and that would be it. Or some people thought if the Russian soldiers come, they will only fight with Ukrainian soldiers, they wouldn't touch any civilians, they wouldn't do any bad. And we were absolutely not ready for what we've seen and what the Ukrainian local people gone through. And I have to say that, yes, all the world is shocked by Bucha, by Mariupol, by Izium, but, you know, this is, I think it's crucial to understand that this is not the exclusion, this is a rule, unfortunately. So if we go to any city, any town, any village which has been occupied by Russians, you will see the same picture. So this is not about following any rules of war, any laws of war, if you want. We've all heard about the tortures towards Ukrainian prisoners of war, and yesterday's evening more than 200 of Ukrainian prisoners of war have been exchanged, and the wife of one of them said that what I've heard from my husband, it's so terrible that we have to release all the guys who are left there, because it's just you cannot imagine how bad is it, how they treat them. So I think we all cannot understand, and especially the Western society, which didn't have any socialistic revolutions, communist regimes. Fortunately, luckily, people just cannot even imagine how terrible this regime can be, and how small, like how little the human rights wait for that regime.
But nonetheless, I mean, I hear you on the sort of gulf of understanding, but nonetheless, there's been pretty solid European unity behind the Ukrainian cause, NATO unity with a few wobbles, and bipartisan support in the US, which has enabled large sums of money to be earmarked for weapons support. Does that surprise you, given the fact that we obviously, on this side of it, as it were, have no real first-hand experience of what's going on? Does it surprise you that unity?
When the war started, of course, we couldn't imagine to which extent it will develop, how long, how large scale it will be, and I was personally surprised when it started, but I think yes, now it's clear that it's not about Ukraine. It's not the war about the piece of territory of Ukraine. It's not about Russia willing to occupy some specific part of Ukraine to use its resources, or, you know, it's the war of, I would say it's a civilizational war, because basically Putin's ideology is that Ukrainians are not the separate nation, not the sovereign country, not the country at all, and he made it very clear in 2008 in Munich, and since then he didn't change his political course, and he invaded Georgia, and then he came to Ukraine 8 years ago, so this war didn't start just 7 months ago. I mean, the first invasion happened 8 years ago. So when
what did he say in Munich? What, was that a speech?
He said to George Bush that, George, you understand, this is not even the state, this is a failed state. And that was the security conference where he has been proved that Ukraine and Georgia will not join NATO. And shortly after that, he invaded in Georgia. And the world didn't react. And I think he thought that he's got like a carte blanche. And then in the same year, then there was Dmitry Medvedev in charge, and he was not happy with our Russian and Ukrainian gas negotiations. And he said, like, if you will be doing like that, you might be the next. And basically, when we moved towards Europe in 2014, we became the next. So if we think about, like, coming back to your question, if we think that it's a war about just a piece of land, then of course this unity is maybe surprising. But if we think that this is a civilization war, and this is the war against, you know, the man who is trying to violate all the rules by which the whole world has been living since the World War II ended, then I think it's logical. And just coming back to your previous question, I would like to underline one more thing which would be good to understand. A lot of people ask me, like, is there a professional army who is at the front line? And I just have to say that, yes, we do have a professional army, but mostly now there are men and women of all professions. There are actors, there are nurses, journalists, a lot of my friends who's been, you know, humanitarians or engineers or whoever. So it is not about just professional army as it happens in the most NATO member countries.
Thank you. That point that you make about Europe's, or the EU specifically, role in 2014 is key, isn't it? I remember it seemed as if Ukraine at that point had a straightforward binary choice to make. Do we lean east or do we lean west? It may not have been that straightforward if you were in Kyiv, but it did seem very clear that at that moment the EU completely missed its opportunity to rise to the occasion. But anyway, do you agree? Or it might
partially, like Poles and Lithuanians supported us a lot, and their presidents came and they helped us very much. But yes, I wouldn't say the EU was too united about that.
Subject perhaps for a whole thinking on another occasion. Professor Friedman, if we can come to you, I want to ask you in a second about what's going to happen over the next 6 months. Which, of course, none of us know, but I'm going to ask you anyway. But first, you posted a long post, I guess, yesterday, or you added to it yesterday after Putin's speech, gaming out, as it were, various nuclear scenarios. Do you think he's bluffing?
I don't think bluffing is really the issue. Going back even to 2014. Putin regularly referred to Russia's nuclear capabilities, regularly made threats of one sort or another, but the basic objective was deterrence. And I think we have to keep in mind that's the basic objective now. What he wants to do is to stop NATO countries intervening directly, as opposed just with weaponry and financial assistance, which is critical, but he wants to stop them intervening directly with their own forces, and he wants them to discourage Ukrainian attacks on Russian territory and on Crimea. That's what his red lines, as it were. There's been a lot of other talk about so-called tactical nuclear weapons, bearing in mind that's a complete misnomer. There's no such thing as a tactical nuclear weapon. If you use it, once they're used, we're in a completely different world. But they're actually very difficult to use to make a difference on the battlefield, as opposed to the many forms of firepower the Russians have got and have already used. They've been able to do enormous damage already with existing conventional missiles and rockets, and tactical battlefield nuclear weapons, if they're used in that way, requires a large concentration of enemy forces to attack. And then you've got to be sure these weapons never having been used in action before, that they'd actually work properly. A lot of Russian weapons haven't worked very well. If you say using it in the Kherson offensive, where there's a lot of water, it could drop into the water. There's a lot of uncertainties if you try to use them, and Ukrainians have made it clear that they're likely to carry on even then. So it would be a shocking thing to happen, but actually it's quite difficult to see that it would do Russia a lot of good, and it would clearly do them also a lot of harm. You have to assume that only would it cause alarm in Ukraine, in the West, it would also cause a lot of alarm in Russia, where people are already getting rather panicky, as we can see from the images today, and nor would China and India, who've been not quite supporters of Russia, but at least have stayed moderately neutral. If you listen to what they were saying in the Security Council today, they're also very alarmed at these forms of escalation. So I think we obviously have to take it seriously, because the weapons exist and they've got means of delivery. But I don't think we should allow it to dominate our thought. I think the mobilization is more important than the nuclear threats. And I think even that, just a note that we may want to come on to, actually, I think the most immediate effects will be the refusal to let Russians already under contract and serving in the front line to leave and to be rotated out of their current service. I think the potential effects of that, which were part of the decree issued by Putin yesterday, may well be quite critical, because it's going to make a lot of difference to morale and discipline at the front.
So just to be clear about that, I hadn't noticed that. Part of the decree is that those currently serving on the front will not be allowed to leave.
Yeah, yeah.
You would have thought that the whole point of calling up 300,000 people would be to allow a rotation.
Well, it'll take a long time before many of those 300,000 or whatever number it is. I mean, it'll grow in number. It'll start much less and eventually build up. It's still going to take a long time before large numbers get to the front, and unlikely that they'll get there with much training or equipment, because there isn't many people to train them and there's not a lot of equipment left. So that's meanwhile, they face the risk of a continuing Ukrainian offensive, possibly now pushing into Luhansk, that will undermine even further Putin's rationalization for this whole exercise. So Ukraine, I think, for the reasons both Nina and Maria have given, actually wants to get a move on with this. Yeah. I mean, the winter's coming, but probably the Ukrainians can cope with the winter better than the Russians, at least on the front line, not hard at home. And now there's an added incentive before these mobilized forces get there. So this is going to push things in the short term quite hard, I think, because there's less incentive for the Ukrainians just to wait and build up. They'll want to move more quickly.
Just on the morale point, do you anticipate that when Russian troops currently serving realize that they're not going to be rotated out, do you anticipate that this will lead to large numbers of them refusing to fight? I mean, by one estimate that Nina drew our attention to, up to 40% are already refusing to fight. I'm not quite sure how that works, because you obviously risk being shot for desertion. Yeah. But
it's a complex situation. You know, one of the things you have to realize is that there's not a single Russian army out there. There's lots of pieces of different army, including, I mean, you know, unfortunately, two of the largest contingents so far have been from the Luhansk and Donetsk, many press ganged into service, some there willingly. They're more or less exhausted now. You've got the Wagner group, the mercenaries, who seem to be fighting their own war. You've got Chechens, who also have got their own command arrangements, and you've got generally a Russian command structure which is weaker because of the loss of a lot of junior officers. So what you're seeing is certain units refusing to do certain things, others holding their ground because they don't have very much choice. It's harder to do maneuvers, I think, in these circumstances. If you're defending a position and nowhere else obviously to go, there's not much you can do. But you will, I think, as we saw in Kyiv, mean that if there is a successful Ukrainian offensive, there'll be no shortage of volunteers to surrender. And you're not going to get the sort of tenacious defense that you saw from Ukrainian defenders, say in Mariupol or Severodonetsk.
Great, thank you. By the way, I should have said at the top, dive in, everybody. You can raise your hand and you can do it online as well. James Wilson, my colleague, might be better than me at spotting people online who want to actually speak up. But and I might come to you, James, in a second to ask you who's saying what. Before I come back to you, Lawrence, on the subject of the winter, Nina, you've done a lot of research for us over the last few months on the gap between weapons that Ukraine has and weapons, quantities of, that Ukraine wants. And it's quite a big gap. Tell us roughly how big that gap is now. And question, is there a risk after Ukraine has shown it's capable of such spectacular success with what it's got, that the West will sit back and say, well, I think that's probably about enough guns and tanks from us then?
Yeah, one of the first pieces on this subject was about what Ukraine wants and what Ukraine gets. And I remember that then Mikhailo Podolyak, the spokesperson for Zelensky, said that Ukraine needs like 55 HIMARS. And we started from...
HIMARS are these... do we know what that actually stands for?
This is multiple rocket launch system in Britain, MLRS, and the same thing in the US called HIMARS, which means like just the rocket system which can shell for the long distance. But we still haven't got those which can shoot for 300 kilometers. Right. But what I would like to say is that we wanted 55 and we started with 4, and now we've got 20. And the thing is that, as far as I understand, it's like the better Ukrainians use them at the battlefield, the more they get little by little, not like you want 50, you've got 50. It's step by step, and it's never enough. You all know that nobody is quite happy with the Germans' position because, for example, they promised to give Ukraine Leopard tanks, and then they refused to do that, and then there are some contracts saying that they will issue something in October 2023, and then something else happens, like we are giving, oh no, we changed our mind, so the gap is big. And within the aid which has been promised and issued, I would say, yes, the first place is held by the US, the second place is held by Poland, the UK is on the third place, and surprisingly, like if we look at the diagram, we would see that the US promised like 4 times more than has been delivered already. Right. And the amount of weapons which has been delivered is equal to what Poland both promised and gave. But we also have to understand that there is some undisclosed data, and we do not know for sure who gave what. But after Putin's speech, the same person, Mikhailo Podolyak, the spokesperson for Zelensky's administration, said that given that nuclear threat for not just Ukraine, but Poland and Baltic countries, and probably Turkey and Bulgaria, because I think we all understand that it might happen in the Black Sea and affect the whole region. He said, we just need more weapons. That's what he said, and I'm afraid it's quite true, because as we all heard, the victory can just be achieved at the battlefield. No negotiations are possible after all the atrocities which Russian army has done. And the second question was like, is there a risk that the West will say, oh, Ukraine is so successful, maybe that's enough? There is always a risk, because all those countries which are issuing the weapons, they are facing, I mean, their politicians, they are facing their internal issues and political questions. Some of them have some elections forthcoming, and the people are not happy with the energy prices, and it's all connected to the war. And yes, some people understand that it's due to Russia, but in some societies you just hear, oh, it's due to Ukraine, it's your war, and it's because of you, we pay more for gas, etc., etc. And of course, their politicians, the politicians there should keep the balance between making their political choice externally and keeping the nation, even not happy, then at least satisfied to some point. So I think there is a risk, but if the West fails, that would mean that the world order has changed and whoever can do whatever. And we have a lot, not a lot, but quite a few nuclear states with authoritarian regimes who would be maybe even inspired by that example and just doing what they want. So I think it's, again, it's not a question of Ukrainian territory being occupied here or there. We pretty understand that. It's a question of the world order and the guarantees on which we all exist on this planet, I would say.
That being so, Lawrence, what's your best guess as to how Western unity generally and Western weapons deliveries specifically will hold up over the winter?
I think they'll hold up. I think the commitment's been made. I don't think I think it would have been much more difficult if there'd been a real stalemate, and it looked like this could go on indefinitely. But Ukraine's shown it can use the weapons that it's been given. It's made progress. Russia is on the back foot because of the mobilization. There's no reason to suppose that holding back is going to make things any easier in the future. If you're going to get negotiations, they're only going to happen when Russia looks like it's about to lose. I don't think there's any incentives at all for the Western governments to hold back. And, you know, despite all that Nina said, which is correct about the pressures, what's still quite impressive is how much public opinion still supports Ukraine. Even in Germany, there's majority support. And I just think the commitment's there. I don't think it's very hard to walk away now. So you're stuck with backing Ukraine. So now how the winter will develop. I think the key question is, these are high intensity wars. They use up an awful lot of ammunition, especially artillery, as we've seen on the Russian side. I mean, they've got real shortages now too. And of course, the Ukrainians have been quite smart using their HIMARS in going after ammunition dumps and supply lines and so on. But I think that's going to be the challenge, because one of the difficulties for the Ukrainians is that plenty of people have sent different sorts of weapons, but turns out they need different sorts of shells to use on different artillery pieces. Keeping that up will I think be quite hard. You don't necessarily need lots of different types of weapons. It's best if you can concentrate on some types with which you're familiar. At which point it's worth noting, and this is not just a quip, that the second largest arms supplier to Ukraine is Russia. Some quite impressive kit has been captured in Kyiv. And some videos are now circulating about Russian artillery being used against Russian lines. I mean, some of this will be more usable than others. Quite a lot of ammunition was seized as well. So that is actually not an insignificant contribution to the Ukrainian war effort.
Thanks a lot. I want to turn to the subject of Russia, actually. Maybe in a bit we can see is it aid Clulo, not right now. Go ahead, James. Go ahead.
No. If you want me to wait,
No,
we'll
I wanted to
wait.
go to Maria first and then maybe come back, if that's all right. Maria, partly because you're geographically closer, what's your assessment of the state of Russian support for Putin now after his speech yesterday? We've seen video of some protests in Moscow and elsewhere. Do you think that's significant?
There are some specific peculiarities of public opinion in Russia, which we really have to bear in mind. So first of all, yes, public opinion will react, and we have seen the first reaction, like some protests in around 40 cities around Russia. But we need to understand that these protests were mainly not against the war with Ukraine. They were mainly against mobilization. And it changes our focus immediately as soon as we understand that generally the numbers which were shown to us both by, let's say, official pro-Kremlin sociological services and independent to the possible extent like Levada Center, they are really fair in saying that at least 2/3 of Russians are positive or neutral. Let's say they are okay, generally speaking, about this military activity of Russian forces against Ukrainian state. And that's why, in my opinion, yes, there will be a reaction. It will be much slower than we can expect, because yesterday they protested, but today they are calmly staying in the queues to the conscription offices, where they are gathered and being sent to the front line, or to the actual, not front line, but to the bordering with Ukraine regions. So there will be no, let's say, internal blow up of public opinion as I see. But at the same time, incremental and pretty slow, but still some kind of delegitimization of Putin as, so to say, effective leader of the nation, the image which he has been developing during all this time in exchange of some restrictions of freedoms and liberties inside his country. Yes, these protests will be in place, in my opinion, but it will be much slower than it is needed to stop, let's say, this war by internal power, internal reaction of Russian society. They will be disappointed, they will be against, but this protest will not be, will be more latent, let's say, more silent than it is needed to stop the official Russian policy.
Maria, last night on Channel 4 News here in the UK, one report from eastern Ukraine included an interview with a Ukrainian soldier or officer who was asked his opinion of the mobilization and the fact that, in principle, up to 300,000 more Russian soldiers were heading his way. And he said, that's fine, we'll just kill more of them, we'll kill them all. Is that pure bravado, or is there some realism there as well? Is that seen as a perfectly reasonable position in Ukraine?
I think it's a pretty realistic position. First of all, because it's absolutely logical in the situation when you have no choice but fight if you want to keep your state still existing, and if you want to stay alive. This is the normal psychological reaction of Ukrainian society as a social organism. So people were not escaping from the country when they faced the necessity to go to the front line and defend the country, but they went to conscription offices. So it's not, let's say, a bravado in my opinion. It's pretty realistic and rational attitude towards the task which is being in front of Ukrainian society, not only in front of Ukrainian army. Secondly, as some military experts say that this, and as Lawrence also said today, that these 300,000 are not expected to appear just tomorrow in the front line, on the front line. And that's the big question, how equipped, how prepared they will be, because we have already had and we still have an experience of fighting forcefully mobilized people in occupied Donbass. These are people are used simply as a cannon fodder, and according to different estimations, it's in between 70 and 100,000 of people who were already mobilized in this occupied part of Donbass, and were sent to fights in Kharkiv region, in Kherson even region, and of course in Donbass itself. And these people, they are just dying by thousands at the days. They were dying at the days of the most intensive fighting, like when Russia attacked Severodonetsk and tried to seize Severodonetsk, Popasna, Lysychansk, all these towns in Luhansk province. And in my opinion, it will be pretty the same, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that the rationality of Ukraine should stop us from asking, for instance, for larger quantities and for better qualities of specific weapons, which we need to repel this attack, because sometimes quantity plays a role, but it should be balanced by, counterbalanced by, for instance, weapons which can prevent the huge attack at specific parts of the front line.
Thanks a lot. Can we go to Aid, do you think, if I'm pronouncing his name right?
He seems keen to chat. He made the point that another 300,000 Russian troops wouldn't actually make the army that much more effective. They'll still have poor equipment, they'll still be fighting an unjust war, and they'll have low morale. And Aid was a soldier for 25 years, and he knows a lot about NATO and Kosovo, so it'd be good to bring him in.
Yeah.
If he's willing.
Aid?
Aid?
Well, in a sense, James has made your point, but
Not as well as he could, I'm sure.
never mind.
We've also got Tony Tabbitt's hand up, and he made the point, he asked, his key question and concern is what the likely long-term scenario would be even if Ukraine wins and drives Russia out. Is it considered likely that Russia would just allow itself to be defeated and the world would become safer? And is that a likely reason in Russian history?
Nina, do you want to have a go at this one? I mean, in a sense, it's what does victory look like, or is it conceivable that a defeated Russia can coexist with the West?
That's a great question. That's a really great question, because initially Ukrainian authorities thought, and we still keep to that point, that we need Russia just to get out of our country by the borders of 1991, when the independent Ukraine established after the USSR collapse. And of course, we are not the nation of invaders. We just need our land, and that's like our mentality. But there are a lot of people in Ukraine who are saying, like, are you people crazy? Do you like, can you imagine that Russia will just go away and will live calmly in a peace, and there would be a normal coexistence, as you say? Maybe they will spend another 10 years, increase their weaponry arsenal, and they will attack again. And there is a lot of voices in Ukrainian society by philosophers, by historians, by all other thinkers, I would call them, which say that we should prepare to maybe to the repetition of that scenario. We should be ever ready to defend our country, not attack Russia, but to defend our country. Right. We should be always aware of that. I cannot even imagine the leader of Russia, the current leader of Russia, admitting that he defeats. Right. That's the problem. That is why the nuclear weapons doesn't sound like a complete bluff for me. Yes, it is a tool of bluff which has been used a lot of times by the USSR and now by Russia. But when the person is cornered and when this person is a KGB officer, I think I cannot imagine the KGB officer being in charge of the big country for 20 years, just saying, oh, sorry, I made a mistake. I give up. But interestingly, I compared today the history of Germany and Russia, because in Germany, people also let happen what happened, yeah? The society supported the party was leading, people didn't care about different processes happening to different parts of society, it doesn't concern me. It's pretty like in Russia, because people didn't care about this war for 7 months. They didn't go for the protest 7 months ago, they just came today, because it didn't concern them. And then, as in this famous phrase, and then they came for me. That's what happened in Russia today. And if we go back to what happened to Nazi Germany, they had mobilization, they had all this meat grinder in Europe, they've been defeated, and then what happened to Nazi Germany? It's been divided. And yeah, just one just one thing. We've read a few days ago, I think it was Ben Hodges who said that we have to be prepared to Russia collapse, because we can't afford it to happen without any control. Right,
and this is fascinating, and I'm really interested to know what Maria and Lawrence and anybody else thinks about this. Because of the scenario you described at the beginning, which is a defeated Russia having another go in the expectation that they would come back and attack again in a few years' time. I've heard you, and I've heard former senior officials at the Ukrainian embassy here, and many others describing the only sort of stable scenario, stable alternative to that you can think of, that anyone can think of, namely a very unstable one in which Russia collapses, in which it breaks up into its constituent republics, and you have an independent Tatarstan and an independent Dagestan, which is one of the places where they don't want to fight. And I can't help thinking that that is a very extreme step from where we are now. And as I say, perhaps less threatening to Ukraine than the alternative, but intrinsically completely unstable. We'll come back to you, but Lawrence, do you think Russia, do you think we should be contemplating, as Ben Hodges and others are saying, a completely self-disassembling Russia?
Look, I remember being in conversations in 1990 about the consequences of what had been happening for the unity of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. And it seemed to me the forces that were at work were so powerful that it was hard to see it holding together. I don't think it's quite the same now. I think the problem with these sorts of wars, once you set them in motion, once Putin sets them in motion with a promise that it wouldn't last long, that it wouldn't be too painful, is you set in motion events that you can't control, that are unpredictable. And so the answer is, he doesn't know, and I don't know, we don't know, because things are going on that could take a number of courses. Certainly the mobilization order won't help in this, because as you mentioned with Dagestan, but it's true of other areas, a lot of the fighting is being done by minority groups. It hasn't been those from Moscow and St. Petersburg that have been pushed into fighting as much as those from the Russian Far East and elsewhere. So that is a risk. It's very hard to see how I mean, first, it's clear Putin can lose. It is possible for a leader to lose. It happens quite a lot. Our countries have lost wars, quite apparently, wars that it was assumed it was unthinkable that we would let ourselves lose. And it's happened because we have changes of government, and that makes this sort of thing easier. The problem is you've got a personalized dictatorship now with Putin, and it's a blow. But I don't think we should get ourselves into thinking that it's impossible that under Putin, Russia just loses, and he has to find some reason to explain why he's moved out. He's already, in a sense, established culpability for this because he said he's fighting NATO now, not just Ukraine, and it's NATO weapons that are making all the difference. So he's got ways of going. Now, I think what could happen is a negotiated withdrawal. Just a month ago, you'd have said any calls for a ceasefire were dangerous for Ukraine because a ceasefire tends to mean that you just stop with the existing lines. We're now moving to a point where if there's a call for a ceasefire, Ukraine can say, yeah, we'll ceasefire while the Russian troops are withdrawing. There's lots of issues, really big issues that have to be resolved. It's going to be very hard to see how they're going to be dealt with bilaterally. At any rate, even if you're going to need sanctions removed, the West has got to be involved. The EU, US has got to be involved. What are you going to do about reparations in that context? How do you handle the war crimes issue? Crimea, I think, is going to be quite difficult for Ukraine to take by force, but you're still going to need some sort of outcome because Ukrainians aren't going to accept it being just lost to Russia. So there's, at some point, I think, there's going to have to be a form of diplomacy, probably involving the Americans, because I can't see anybody else who would do it. That would be about providing Russia with a more dignified exit. If it just ends in collapse, then all this uncertainty, this unpredictability will overwhelm, I think, the Kremlin. I just don't think they've got a means of coping with that. So my guess is, it's only a guess, that at some point, if for example, there's another successful Ukrainian offensive, particularly if it's in the Donbass, which is what Putin claims the fighting is all about now, then I think you're going to see quite an accelerated move, which may not succeed, to try to get some sort of negotiated outcome. It has to, I should say, this won't be Ukraine conceding any territory to Russia. I don't think that's a significant potential outcome now.
Thank you. Maria, from where you're sitting, just coming back to the question we started with, do you think that global support for your country will continue long enough for victory? And do you think that victory will be the collapse of Russia, or just a more straightforward defeat and withdrawal?
I think that the main challenge here is that when it comes to different Western allies of Ukraine, there is still a bit different understanding of what should be or what might be a victory of Ukraine. So generally, there is a compromise that, at least formal, that Ukraine can define on its own at what time to say that we have won. And withdrawal of Russian forces from entire territory of Ukraine seems to be the general compromise as well. But when it comes to the future of Russia and what will be inside Russia and what will happen to Russian Federation as a state, whether it will be collapsed, reformed, the change of regime, whatever, here I don't see any unity among our Western allies. And that's why I think from rational point of view, Ukraine should be oriented on where we have a common agreement with our partners that the entire territory of Ukraine should be liberated. And I wouldn't say that this is 100% of support, which will not change under no circumstances to reach this, to fulfill this task. I think that here we can move like with short-term slots, let's say. So for the next half of the year, I don't see any ground that this unity will be cracked down and that this unity will change. I think that the tempos and dynamics of support to Ukraine to make Russians withdraw or to defeat Russian army will be just increasing, and we will see it, no changes here. But what will happen in spring, in summer, let's say in the military campaign of 2023, there might be some new variables. There will be results of elections, for instance, in US. There will be the results of energy problems in winter in Europe. And that doesn't mean automatically that someone out of our allies will automatically and diametrically change their position and make Ukraine concede or start conceiving Ukraine to concede some territories. No, not necessarily. But the overall mood of what should be treated as the strategy towards this victory, this mood might be changed next year. And here in Ukraine, we should be, and we are very cautious about that, and we prepare our partners not just to kill Putin and Putin's regime softly, but to be more rapid, more intensive in our actions. For us, it means no negotiations about selling out our territories. For our Western allies, to keep this unity in terms of sanctions and in terms of military support for Ukraine. And at least until spring 2023, I think there will be no chances that this unity will be changed. The main challenge, in my opinion, is not just that the unity will be cracked down, but that the opinion, how intensive the further support should be, here might be some changes. And if some countries will start thinking and acting like there is slow tempo is better, dose and support is better than intensive sending of weapons, for instance, sanctions should not be strengthened, it's enough. So this is the main challenge, because overall, generally, unity can be still preserved. But the tempos might be changed, and that's the main challenge for us to tackle and to counteract in case it appears next year.
Thank you. Briefly, the flag's gone up, Nina, but you have the last word. Anthony Cope has a question. I want to know your definition of victory, but before you get to that, he says, what will be the effect of the referendums in the occupied regions? And it is a question. We all assume it's a foregone conclusion that the referendums will be 95% pro-Russian. Is there no possibility at all that there could be an extraordinary demonstration of democracy in those? No. Why is that? Just because they'll just...
Because it's imposed from the above, and if Vladimir Putin said that he would be happy to accept those territories, what else answer can be? I remember the elections in Russia when his party Единая Россия was elected, and there were 146% of the voters voting for that party in some region of Russia. So this is not about democracy at all. Yeah, and the effect of those referendums might be not just for mobilizing people on that territories or whatever. I think this is a political, like playing political cards, because Ukrainian army is trying to take those territories back. And as soon as Putin proclaims them to be Russian, that would mean that NATO weapons, Ukrainian army is attacking Russia, and it then gives him any reason to escalate, to make the next step.
Your definition of victory?
Getting Russian troops out of Ukraine in the borders of 1991.
So including Crimea, even though that would mean complete humiliation for Putin, or especially because it would mean complete
well, it was complete humiliation for all Ukrainian state 8 years ago. So why should we care about saving dignity of Putin after that? It's him who has to care about his dignity and his responsibility of what he's done. We have our land, and by the way, no negotiations with Russia, no Russian promises were really fulfilled. No ceasefires during these 8 years were kept from Russia. We all remember this grain agreement when Russia attacked Odessa port just the very next night after Russia promised not to hit it. And we had, by the way, the forced de-weaponization of the whole country. It was Ukraine who lost its third largest nuclear potential in 1996. And Russia, along with the US and the UK, was one of the guarantors of Ukrainian territorial integrity. So this is an example of how the agreements with Russia end. Why should we care about their dignity then?
Point taken. And by the way, I was not speaking up for against Putin's humiliation out of consideration for Putin, just because I was slightly worried that humiliated Putin might be more likely to go nuclear. But anyway, Nina, Maria, Lawrence, everybody, thanks for coming. Thanks for listening. I have noted down 4 sort of answers or things to take away. One is an answer to the question. Yes, I think everyone agrees that we can count on continued global unity behind the Ukrainian cause, at least until the spring next year, and in large part because of the spectacular success of the Kyiv counteroffensive. Many different definitions of victory, many different forecasts of how long support within Russia for Putin will last. And I think it's a key point made by Maria at the end that the real struggle will be to keep up the pressure in terms of sanctions, which are so important to isolate and hurt the Russian economy, but which have a sort of blowback effect as well on everyone who imposes them. Anyway, thank you all very much, and I really hope that we will not do this again after another 200 days.